Beautiful, are you alone?
I am, sir.
Then may I join you?
Please sit.
They say every bride remembers her wedding day forever. I remember mine too, except I wasn't the bride. The grand ceremony hall of Silver Peak Pack has never looked more beautiful. White flowers cascade from every pillar. Lanterns spill gold across the ceiling like captured stars. The crowd sits in their finest, faces soft and open, tilted toward the altar with the kind of warmth that only exists when people believe they are watching something sacred unfold. I have stood in this hall 100 times in my imagination. I pictured it differently. I chose these flowers. I approved this music. I confirmed every name on that guest list. I spent 3 months in this hall making it perfect, and not one person in this room knows that the woman sitting alone at the back in a gray dress is the reason any of it exists. Not one person has thought to ask. My mother sits in the front row. She has not looked back once. She is wearing the blue dress I helped her select for this occasion 3 weeks ago, when we were still pretending that my presence here was something other than what it is. She looks proud. She looks like a mother at her daughter's wedding. She is, just not mine. At the altar, Damien lifts my sister's hand. The ring catches the lantern light as he slides it onto her finger. The same ring, the same words, the same future I had pressed against my chest like something precious. The officiant's voice carries across the hall, and I recognize every phrase because I once whispered them to myself in a mirror, alone, practicing the particular joy of saying them out loud to someone who had chosen you. Someone who chose you first and meant it. I sit perfectly still, because if I move, if I breathe too deeply or blink too slowly, something inside me will crack open in front of 400 witnesses, and they will call it drama. They will call it jealousy. They will say she never could handle Celeste having nice things. So I sit still. I press my hands flat against my thighs, and I breathe in measures, and I look at nothing in particular. I have always been very good at sitting still. It is the thing my family trained me for without meaning to. Then I hear them. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, carrying the particular weight of someone who has never needed to hurry because the world has always rearranged itself ahead of him. The air in my corner of the hall changes, thickens, the way air changes before a storm announces itself. I feel it before I hear it, and I hear it before I look up. Something in the room shifts without moving. Alpha King Roy stops beside my chair. He doesn't look at the altar. He doesn't look at my sister in her adjusted dress, or at Damien with his satisfied expression, or at my mother who still has not turned around. He looks at me, not past me, not through me, not with the polite, unseeing gaze of someone who has registered my presence and decided it requires no further attention. He looks at me the way people look at things they find genuinely worth looking at. And when he leans down, close enough that his voice belongs only to me, the entire wedding disappears. The music, the flowers, the 400 people who have spent 8 months deciding I don't belong here. All of it recedes to the edges of something I am no longer part of. Beautiful. Are you alone? My heart slammed against my ribs. Not from the word beautiful, though no one had said it to me in longer than I could accurately recall. From the fact that he was still looking at me when he said it. I arrived early. Of course I did. 8 months of planning had carved the schedule into my bones. Flowers delivered by 7, lanterns lit by 8, guests seated 30 minutes before the ceremony. My body had followed the timeline automatically before my mind caught up with the reminder that none of this was mine anymore. I had stood outside the hall for 11 minutes before walking in, long enough to consider leaving, long enough to decide that leaving was the one thing I refused to give them. I chose the back corner because it was the only honest seat in the room. Anywhere closer, and people would have to decide, look at me or look away. And I was tired of being a decision someone had to make. The back corner required nothing from anyone. I could be present without being a problem. I had spent most of my life perfecting exactly that balance, and I was exhausted by how well I had learned it. It had started, as most quiet devastations do, without shouting. 8 months ago, Damien had arrived at my mother's house with the careful face of a man who had rehearsed his words for gentleness. He loved Celeste, he said. He had realized it slowly and then all at once, and he was sorry, truly, but he hoped I would understand because I had always been the understanding one. He said it like a compliment, like my capacity to absorb damage was a quality he admired. My mother sat across from us both with the composed sympathy of a woman who had already known and had decided the situation was manageable. She patted my hand afterward. She said, "You'll be all right, Virginia. You always are." I had not screamed. I had not thrown the ring. I had folded myself smaller, the way I had always folded myself smaller when the world needed the space I was occupying, and I had let my future quietly transfer itself to my sister like an inheritance she had already spent without asking. Now Celeste moved down the aisle in a dress altered from my original fitting measurements, and the hall exhaled with collective adoration. She was radiant. She knew it. She had always known how to stand inside a moment that belonged to someone else and make it look like it was built for her. Damien watched her approach with an expression I recognized in my chest before I recognized it in my mind. I had spent 2 years studying his face. That expression meant he had gotten exactly what he wanted. I looked down at my hands and said nothing, because there was nothing left to say. Then the bench shifted beside me. No invitation, no announcement, just presence, enormous and unhurried, settling into the space next to me as though it had always been reserved. I looked up slowly and felt my breath leave my body in a way that had nothing to do with grief. Alpha King Roy was not watching the ceremony. He was watching me, with the steady, unguarded attention of a man who had looked at everything in this hall and decided I was the only thing in it worth studying. He leaned close. His voice dropped low enough that only I could hear it beneath the swelling ceremony music. "Beautiful. Are you alone?" My heart slammed against my ribs because across the hall, past the white flowers I chose and the candles I approved, Celeste had turned from the altar. She was looking directly at us, and the expression on my sister's face was not surprise. It was the cold, calculated look of a woman who had just identified something she intended to destroy before it had the chance to become anything she couldn't control. He didn't leave. That was the first thing that surprised me. When the ceremony ended and the hall dissolved into movement, every dignitary in the room migrated instinctively toward the high table, toward importance, toward the places that confirmed their own significance. Roy stayed beside me. He didn't explain it. He didn't perform it. He simply remained, as though he had made a quiet decision and saw no reason to announce it. And the particular steadiness of him in my corner of the hall felt like something I had not been offered in a very long time. The stillness of him next to me was so unexpected that I didn't know what to do with it. I had spent 8 months being the person people moved away from. I had forgotten what it felt like to be the person someone moved toward. Not out of obligation, not out of pity, not out of the careful social arithmetic of someone managing an awkward situation. Just toward, simply and without agenda. We didn't speak much at first. He existed beside me the way solid things exist, without apology, without condition, and it was simultaneously the strangest and the most decent thing anyone had done for me all day. When the reception spilled into the gardens, he offered his arm with the calm certainty of someone who had already decided and was simply waiting for me to catch up. I took it before I could remind myself of all the reasons I shouldn't. He guided me away from the noise, through the warm press of bodies and laughter and the particular performance of a wedding reception in full celebration, to a corner of the grounds where the lanterns burned softer and the music reached us like something pleasant rather than relentless. He had chosen this corner deliberately. I understood that only after we arrived. He asked me simple questions. What did I love? Where did I feel most like myself? Whether I was always this quiet or whether today was something specific. Today is specific, I said. He nodded, unsurprised, as though he had already suspected and simply wanted to hear me confirm it. Then he said, then tomorrow should be different. I almost believed him. That was the frightening part. Not the doubt, the almost. I hadn't almost believed anything in 8 months. Almost felt enormous after nothing.
I was still turning those words over in my chest when Roy shifted almost imperceptibly beside me. Not much, just enough that his shoulder angled slightly between me and the rest of the garden. A small, deliberate adjustment. I followed his gaze and understood why. Celeste stood 20 feet away, champagne glass raised, bridal smile perfectly intact, but her eyes had found mine with the precision of someone who doesn't stumble into eye contact, someone who seeks it with purpose. Roy had seen her looking before I had. He had moved before I noticed I needed him to. Besides Celeste, Damien followed his wife's gaze across the garden. I watched something move across his face and recognized it before I could name it. Not guilt, something rawer and less dignified than guilt. The specific injury of a man who let something go and is only now standing at his own wedding reception with his new wife beside him, understanding the full weight of what he released. His jaw tightened, his shoulders shifted. He raised his glass to his lips and did not drink. Roy noticed. I noticed Roy noticing. Neither of us said anything about it immediately. Roy leaned slightly closer. "The man watching you," he said quietly, eyes still forward, voice unhurried as ever. "He looks like he's made a decision he regrets." "He made his decision 8 months ago," I said. "Yes." Roy turned then and looked at me with those storm-gray eyes, which means he's about to become a problem. Before I could answer, my phone vibrated in my pocket. A message. No name, a number I didn't recognize. 3 words that turned the warm garden air completely to ice. He told me everything. He knocked at 7 in the morning. No announcement, no message sent ahead. Just Roy on my doorstep in the early light, looking like a man who had been awake for a while and had decided somewhere between darkness and dawn that he wanted to be here rather than wherever protocol suggested he should be. He asked if I would show him the real Silver Peak, not the ceremonial grounds or the diplomatic corridors or the carefully curated paths that pack leadership walked visiting dignitaries down, the parts that didn't make it onto any official tour. I took him to the old training grounds first, abandoned a generation ago, reclaimed now by wildflowers that pushed through the cracked earth in colors nobody planted and nobody tended. Then to my grandmother's herb garden at the pack's eastern edge, which I had maintained alone for 3 years without anyone asking me to, because some things you preserve out of love before you understand what you are preserving them for. Then up to the ridge, where the whole of Silver Peak spread below us like a living map of everything I had ever known and almost lost. We talked for hours. He listened the way powerful people almost never listen, completely, without waiting for his turn, without filtering what I said through the lens of what he had expected to hear. He asked questions that required actual answers and remembered what I had said 3 topics earlier and returned to it carefully. At some point, I stopped monitoring what came out of my mouth and simply spoke. It was either the most natural thing that had happened to me in months or the most dangerous, possibly both. By midday, the pack knew. In a settlement this size, a secret survives approximately 4 hours before it becomes common knowledge. Celeste received the news like a physical affront delivered personally. She had spent her entire life being chosen over Virginia, had organized her entire sense of self around that single repeated fact, and the idea that the most powerful man in all the territories was spending his mornings voluntarily in her sister's company destabilized something she had not known was load-bearing. She began carefully, the way she always began. A word to Elder Marin about Virginia's history of emotional difficulty. A gentle concern raised to Damien about whether Virginia's proximity to Roy reflected something less than innocent feeling. She never raised her voice. She had learned early that quiet damage is the kind that never gets traced back to its source. Damien received Celeste's concern with the focused attention of a man who recognized an opportunity dressed as a worry. But later, when I passed him near the communal hall, and he saw Roy walking 2 steps behind me with the ease of someone who had decided where he belonged, something cracked in Damien's expression for just a moment. Not rage, something smaller and more honest than rage. He looked for one unguarded second like a man who had miscalculated something significant. He recovered immediately, straightened, nodded to Roy with formal respect, and looked through me entirely. But I had seen it, and I filed it away like evidence. Roy walked beside me back toward the pack center and said nothing for a long moment. Then quietly, without preamble, "Someone is working very hard to make sure people see you a certain way before they get the chance to see you themselves." I stopped walking. "How long have you known?" "Since this morning," he said. "One of my advisors received a visitor before breakfast." The cold moved through me slowly, from the top down. "Who?" Roy's expression didn't change, but something behind his eyes did. A careful, deliberate stillness, the look of a man deciding how much truth the moment requires. "Your brother-in-law. He brought documents, Virginia, the kind that don't exist, which means someone made them." The senior council had convened that morning in the temporary chamber beside the Great Hall. I wasn't there. I was never going to be there, but Silver Peak's walls have always been thin in the ways that matter, and by mid-afternoon the shape of what had been said reached me through 3 different mouths, each version slightly softer than the truth, which told me the truth was sharper than anyone wanted to hand me directly. Damien had not attacked me. That was the precise and devastating genius of it. He had stood before the council's senior members, and he had expressed concern,
gently, sorrowfully, with the reluctance of a man dragged forward by duty. He spoke about my emotional state following our separation, the instability, his word, soft as a blade wrapped in linen, that had worried those close to me. He suggested my proximity to the Alpha King might reflect something less than genuine connection, that a woman in my position, stripped of status and stability, might unconsciously seek powerful attachments for reasons that had nothing to do with the man himself. He said my name with such tender, wounded care throughout that every elder in that room would remember his generosity long after they forgot his motive. I knew this pattern. I had lived inside it for 2 years. By the time I saw Roy that afternoon, the change was subtle enough that someone without my particular education in warmth withheld might have missed it entirely. A question that arrived a half-beat slower than it would have yesterday. A pause before he smiled that hadn't existed before. The particular quality of a man holding 2 contradictory pictures of the same person and trying, carefully and without prejudice, to reconcile them. It felt like watching a door begin to close in slow motion, slowly enough that you could see exactly what you were about to lose, and not quite quickly enough to stop it. That evening, Roy seated me beside him at the high table. The great hall registered it in one collective breath, heads turning, conversations interrupting themselves mid-sentence, the specific electric attention of a community recalibrating its social understanding in real time. I sat straight and kept my face composed, and felt 400 people deciding what this meant. Celeste sat at the formal family table 20 feet away. She smiled throughout dinner without a single lapse, warm, gracious, the picture of a woman who bore no one any ill feeling whatsoever. She had been practicing that expression since childhood. She was very, very good at it. Damien raised his glass to me from across the room. The gesture was perfect, public, generous, visible to everyone seated between us. But his hand was not entirely steady. I noticed it before anyone else would have thought to look. A small tremor in the wrist, quickly controlled, lasting less than a second. Controlled the way a man controls something when the control itself requires effort. He smiled with his whole face, and I smiled back with equal precision, and thought, I see you. I see exactly what you're doing, and I am not folding this time. But beneath the composure, something cold was spreading through my chest. Roy had been quiet beside me for most of the meal. When the formalities concluded, he leaned close. Someone requested a formal review, he said quietly, of your background, your associations, your history. I set my cup down with great care. When? This afternoon. It came through official council channels, Virginia, which means whoever filed it has standing. The hall hummed cheerfully around us. Celeste laughed at something her husband said, the sound bright and deliberate and carrying. It was signed by 2 council members. One of them was Damien. I nodded once. I already knew that part. Who was the second? He held my gaze for a long moment. Your mother.
My mother. I sat with those 2 words through the entire night. I didn't sleep. I didn't pace. I sat in the single chair beside my fire and held the information the way you hold something that has burned you, carefully at a controlled distance, trying to understand the full shape of the damage before you attempt to assess how deep it runs. She had signed it. Not just Celeste,
Not just Damien. My mother had put her name to a formal document designed to dismantle me through official channels, which meant she had chosen to hurt me in the way that would be hardest to recover from. Again. The letter surfaced on Tuesday. I didn't know about it Tuesday. I didn't know about it Wednesday morning. I discovered it the way you discover most things designed to destroy you quietly, too late for prevention, just early enough for survival if you move immediately and without hesitation. What I knew first was Roy. The change had arrived so precisely calibrated that someone without my particular education in withheld warmth might have missed it. But I had grown up in a house where love expressed itself through the half-second delay before a smile, through the questions that were remembered for Celeste and forgotten for me. I knew managed distance the way I knew my own name. Roy was courteous on Wednesday where he had been warm on Monday, present on schedule where he had previously been present by choice. He responded to everything I said with the careful attentiveness of a man who was still listening but had begun, somewhere beneath the listening, to evaluate what he heard against information he had received from other sources. I recognized it completely. I had simply hoped, briefly against the better judgment that years of experience had been quietly assembling, that it was something I had finally left behind me, that this time would be different, that I had misread the room. I went to Marta Thursday morning because I had no one else, and because Marta was the kind of woman who had outlasted 4 pack leaders by paying attention to precisely the things other people considered beneath their notice. The archive hall smelled of old parchment and beeswax and the particular dusty patience of a space where truth gets stored rather than performed. Marta herself looked at me over her reading spectacles with the expression of someone who had been expecting this visit and had prepared accordingly. I told her what I needed. She didn't ask why. She simply turned to her shelves and began. She found it in 40 minutes, a routine cross-reference she had flagged 2 days prior that hadn't made sense until now. She placed it on the table in front of me without ceremony or preamble. The letter bore my handwriting with unsettling accuracy. My loops, my letter spacing, the specific way I formed the V at the beginning of my name. It was addressed to the leader of North Fen Pack, and it suggested, in measured, precise language, that the Alpha King's extended stay at Silver Peak represented a diplomatic opportunity worth exploiting for territorial advantage. It was elegant, it was damning, and it was not mine. Marta tapped the upper right corner of the parchment with one quiet, deliberate finger. Paper stock, she said simply. This grade isn't in any supply you have access to. I checked the archive inventory twice. Where does it come from? Marta looked at me over her spectacles with the steady patience of a woman who had already done the work and was simply waiting for me to catch up to the answer. Private household order, placed 3 weeks ago, delivered to the newly established residence of... Celeste, I said. Celeste, Marta confirmed. Neither of us said anything else for a moment. The silence was sufficient. I sat with the paper in my hands and felt 2 things arrive simultaneously. A cold fury so clean and precise it was almost clarifying, and something harder beneath it. The crystalline, load-bearing certainty of a woman who has just reached the absolute outer limit of what she will absorb without answering back.
I had folded for Damien. I had folded for my mother. I had made myself small and still and endlessly accommodating in that wedding hall and in every room that came before it, across every year that preceded this one. I stood up slowly. I need to file a formal hearing request. Marta was already pulling the documentation from her second drawer. I reached for the papers and the door to the archive hall burst open, one of Roy's senior guards breathing with the controlled urgency of someone trained not to run, but running anyway. "Miss Virginia," he looked at me with eyes carrying the specific weight of news that cannot be softened by delivery. "The Alpha King has canceled all informal engagements effective immediately." A pause that compressed an entire catastrophe into the space of 2 seconds. "And he has summoned Damien to a private meeting, alone, right now." The paper went cold in my hands. If Damien reached Roy before my evidence did, if he got one final unwitnessed hour to shape the narrative, there would be nothing left to save. I had minutes, possibly fewer. I didn't go to Roy. Every instinct screamed at me to find him first, to get ahead of Damien, to explain myself before the version of me being constructed in that private meeting became the only version Roy had access to. But I had spent 8 months reacting, shrinking, trying to manage what other people thought of me by making myself smaller and more palatable and easier to set aside. I went to Marta instead. We worked for 2 hours without pausing. We built a timeline, clean, precise, irrefutable. The kind of truth that doesn't require anyone to like you in order to function correctly. I submitted the formal hearing request to the Council Administrative Office at noon. 1 page, precise language, no embellishment. Signed with my full name in the clearest handwriting I had ever produced, because I was done writing myself in pencil in rooms that deserved permanent ink. Damien's formal objection arrived within the hour. Procedural concerns, he said, with the barely contained urgency of a man whose composure was developing visible seams. Roy granted the hearing personally before the afternoon ended. He set the date for the following morning. I learned this from his guard, not from Roy himself. The distance was still there. The door still not fully closed, but no longer open the way it had been 3 days ago.
That night, I sat at my table with the full case laid out before me in the candlelight. Every document in sequence, every date verified, every thread pulled tight and tested. I went through it until I could have presented it in my sleep. I was ready. Almost. There was one thing left that didn't belong in a council chamber. One weight I had been carrying for 8 months that needed to be set down here, tonight, before I walked into that hearing carrying everything except the one truth that had always mattered most of all. I heard the knock at 9 o'clock, hesitant, twice rehearsed, the knock of someone who had turned back at least twice before finally raising their hand. Serena looked older than I had allowed myself to notice in years. No careful presentation, no public armor, just my mother, plainly dressed, hands folded with the specific stillness of a woman who has run out of managed things to say, and arrived, perhaps for the first time, without a prepared version of herself. I stepped aside, old habit, the accommodation reflex that had never fully learned it wasn't required of me, and she came in and looked around my small cottage, the herbs at the rafters, the single chair, the neat, spare, sufficient life I had built in the space left over after everything else was redistributed to someone else. "I heard about the hearing," she said. "Everyone has." A silence. Then the carefully shaped version of accountability, the one calibrated to cost the least. "I want you to know I didn't sign that document willingly. Damien pressured me. The forgery, the letter, none of that was something I was part of.
I looked at my mother for a long, quiet moment. "I believe you," I said. She blinked. She had prepared for resistance and received agreement, which left her with nothing to push against. But that's not actually what hurt me. And then I said it, all of it, not with the heat of someone who has been saving an explosion, with the calm, precise clarity of someone who has spent 8 months finding exactly the right words for a conversation she wasn't sure she would ever be brave enough to have. I told her what it felt like to plan a wedding and watch it become Celeste's. I told her what it felt like to stand in this same room while she explained with perfect gentleness that sometimes these things happen and that Virginia was always strong enough to absorb them and move forward without requiring anyone to account for what she had lost. I told her that being called strong every time I was left behind had taught me that my pain was a resource this family consumed, rather than a reality anyone felt responsible for. "You made my grief into a compliment," I said, "and I let you, because I wanted you to think well of me more than I wanted you to see what you were doing to me every time you chose her without acknowledging that choosing her meant choosing against me." The words landed in the room and stayed there. She did not deflect them. For once, she simply let them be true. Her hands, folded in her lap, pressed together until the knuckles went white and stayed white. When she finally spoke, her voice had been stripped of every careful, managed layer, down to something underneath that I had rarely, if ever, heard from her. "I thought you would be fine. You were always the one who was fine." "I was fine," I said, "because no one ever asked if I wasn't, and I was too busy being easy to tell you." The silence that followed had a different quality than every silence before it. It had weight, shape, the texture of something that could not be unsaid, which meant, for the first time between us, it was genuinely honest. She reached across the table and placed her hand over mine. She did not transform in that moment. She did not become the mother I had needed her to be. She was still who she was, a woman who had loved her daughters unequally and called it practicality for so long she had forgotten it was a choice she made repeatedly. But she said, with the plain, exhausted simplicity of someone who had finally run entirely out of constructed words, "I should have chosen you. I didn't. I don't know how to fix that." I looked at her hand resting on mine. "You can't fix it. But you can watch tomorrow." She left without ceremony. I slept without the weight of an unsaid thing for the first time in 8 months. At 3 in the morning, my window shuddered with a sharp, urgent knock. Roy's youngest guard, breathless, wide-eyed with the particular expression of someone delivering news that genuinely cannot survive until morning. "They've arrested Marta," he said. "Damien filed a tampering charge an hour ago. The evidence, Miss Virginia, they've seized everything, every document, the timeline, the paper stock comparison, all of it." The floor dropped out from under me completely. "All of it?" He nodded. "You'll have to walk in there tomorrow with nothing." I stood in my doorway in the cold pre-dawn dark and understood that this was exactly what they had planned for. They had let me build the case, then they had taken it, and now they were waiting to see if I would fold. I stood outside the council chamber in my gray dress and understood with complete and settled clarity that this was the moment I had been practicing for my entire life without knowing that was what I was doing. Every time I folded, every time I made myself smaller than I was, every time I absorbed what I should have refused and called it grace and called it strength and called it anything except what it actually was,
It had all been preparation for this specific morning, this specific door, this specific choice between shrinking one final time or walking through it fully upright and refusing to apologize for the space I occupied. I walked through it. The room was full. Pack elders in formal seats, royal advisors with careful, unreadable expressions built from years of professional neutrality, soldiers lining the walls in dress livery. I felt every eye in the chamber find me simultaneously as I crossed the threshold, and I let them look, all of them, without flinching, without the instinct to make myself smaller or softer or easier for the room to accommodate. I was done with that. Celeste sat near the front in ivory composure, the picture of a woman who had arrived fully prepared to be wrongly accused and intended to forgive it with visible grace. Damien occupied the soldier's bench with the stillness of a man who had over-prepared and was only now beginning to feel the first cold whisper of doubt about whether preparation had been enough.
At the back of the room, in a plain seat chosen without hierarchy or designation, my mother sat. She did not look away when I entered. She held my gaze steadily and without performance, keeping the only promise I had asked her to keep. Roy sat at the head of the chamber in the Alpha's formal chair. He looked at me when I entered with an expression I could not fully read, watchful, contained, holding something carefully in both directions. I had no papers, no documented evidence, no archive records or correspondence timelines. Damien had made sure of that before dawn. I had walked in here with exactly one thing: the truth, spoken plainly, in the right order. I walked to the center of the room and I began, not with performance, not with the trembling voice of a woman petitioning to be believed, with the flat, precise, unhurried clarity of someone recounting facts in the sequence they occurred because the sequence itself was the argument. I described the stationary order. I gave the date. I described the watermark characteristics and the paper grade and the archive inventory records I had memorized before they were seized. I described the timeline of composition against the timeline of access with enough specific detail that the room would understand I was not constructing a story. I was remembering one. Celeste's composure held through the first 3 minutes. I watched it hold with the focused attention of someone who knew exactly what she was looking for. I watched her maintain the expression of patient, wounded dignity she had rehearsed, and I kept speaking. And I watched the composure begin to develop the specific tension of something held past the point where holding it is natural. Then I said the date. The specific delivery date, the one that placed her household stationery in her possession 11 days before the letter was supposedly composed by me. Something behind her eyes shifted, not dramatically, just a small, cold movement, confidence to calculation to the particular stillness of a woman whose options have become suddenly, visibly finite. She stood before I finished the sentence. "This is exactly what she does," Celeste said, and her voice had lost every note of its careful music, sharp now, uncontrolled, the voice of someone abandoning a rehearsed strategy in real time because the strategy was visibly failing. She cannot stand that she lost. She cannot stand that Damien chose me, that our mother loves me, that she has always been the difficult one, the dramatic one, the one who ruins everything she touches and then acts as though the world owes her something for it. Sit down. 2 words, quiet as stone settling into still water. Roy had not raised his voice. He did not need to. The room went absolutely and completely silent with the specific quality of silence that follows something irreversible, the kind that means everyone present understands that what just happened cannot be walked back. He stood. He crossed the chamber floor with the same unhurried deliberateness he brought to everything, and he stopped in front of me. Not beside me, in front of me, facing me, close enough that the meaning of the gesture was available to every person in that room simultaneously. "I apologize," he said, "for the moments I doubted you. I held his gaze and felt 8 months of accumulated weight begin to redistribute itself, and then, gradually and completely, release. He turned to face the council with the full authority of someone who has made a judgment and has no remaining interest in debating it. I've heard enough. What followed was not a speech, it was a rendering, clean, decisive, delivered in the tone of a man who had reached his conclusion and saw no productive reason to ornament it with anything beyond the facts of it. Celeste removed from her pack position pending full investigation. Damien's council seat suspended immediately and without appeal. The conspiracy entered into the official territorial record under the Alpha King's personal seal, which meant it could not be quietly buried, conveniently revised, or selectively forgotten by anyone who might later find it useful to try. And then Roy turned back to me. He didn't reach for my hand with the tentative uncertainty of a man making a gesture he was still deciding on. He took it with the calm, complete finality of someone removing all remaining ambiguity from a situation that had been made deliberately ambiguous by people with reasons to keep it that way. He faced the room. Every elder, every advisor, every soldier, every witness who had spent 8 months watching people try to make me disappear. His voice was quiet, and it carried to every corner. Virginia belongs beside me. He said it the way you say something that has always been true and simply required saying out loud. And anyone who works against her answers to me. The room did not exhale. It forgot to breathe entirely. 6 months later, the grand ceremony hall of Silver Peak filled again. White flowers, glowing lanterns, 400 faces turned toward the altar with the open, unguarded warmth of people who believe they are witnessing something that was always meant to happen, something that arrived exactly when it was supposed to, by exactly the path it needed to take to mean what it means. I stood at the entrance in a dress made entirely from my measurements, not adjusted from another woman's pattern, not inherited from a redistributed future, made for me, from the very beginning, for this specific day and no other. It fit the way things only fit when they were built for you. Completely, without apology, without the small, persistent wrongness of wearing something that belonged to someone else first and still carries the shape of their absence. My grandmother's herbs were braided into my hair, the same ones I had tended alone in the small garden at the pack's eastern edge for 3 years. Because some things you maintain out of love before you understand what you are maintaining them for. I understood now. I had been tending them for this morning, for this particular light, for the version of me that finally knew she was allowed to have a morning like this one. At the back of the hall, in a plain seat with no designation, my mother sat. Not the front row. She had not asked for the front row, and I had not offered it. She had arrived early and chosen her own seat, and when I passed her in the entrance corridor, she had looked at me with everything she still didn't know how to say, gathered quietly in her expression. I had nodded. She had nodded back. For now, in this season of things, that was exactly enough. At the end of the aisle, Roy stood. He was not looking at the flowers or the crowd or the careful, dignified pageantry of a pack assembled to witness its Alpha King's union. He was looking at me.
with the same focused, unhurried, completely unperformed attention he had turned on me at the back of this same hall 8 months ago, when I was in a gray dress I hadn't chosen, in a seat that wasn't meant to hold me, trying to disappear in a room I had built with my own hands. He had stopped beside that woman and decided she was the most interesting person in the room. He had looked at her the way people look at things they find genuinely worth looking at. He had not changed his mind once in the 8 months between that moment and this one. Not when Damien brought documents, not when the council reviewed her history, not when the evidence was seized and she walked into that chamber with nothing but the truth spoken in the right order. Not once. I walked toward him and felt with every step the particular sensation of moving through a space that had been waiting for you. Not a space you were squeezing yourself into, not a future inherited from someone else's discarded plans, but something constructed from your exact dimensions, your specific presence, your precise measurements, and no one else's. Built for you from the first decision to the last detail. Yours before you knew to ask for it.
Roy took my hand when I reached him, not with ceremony, with the simple, complete, unhurried certainty of a man who decided something in the space between one heartbeat and the next, months ago, at the back of a crowded hall, and had not once since then required a reason to revisit that decision, or weigh its cost, or wonder whether he had chosen correctly. I thought about the gray dress hanging in my cottage, about Marta, reinstated and quietly, deeply satisfied, about Celeste, absent from this hall for the first time in both our lives at an occasion that mattered, not because I had excluded her, but because her own choices had carried her here, to this absence, by the most direct available route. About the version of me that had sat still and silent in this hall 8 months ago, holding herself together by pure, determined will, certain that if she moved, something inside her would shatter in a way that could not be reassembled in a room full of people who would watch it happen and call it drama. She had not shattered. She had endured the thing she was most afraid of and discovered that she was still there on the other side of it, still herself, still whole, simply waiting for conditions that matched what she deserved. Waiting for evidence and for truth and for a man who stopped walking when everyone else in the room kept moving, who leaned down and asked a question that had nothing to do with status or strategy or the careful social mathematics of a community calculating who deserved to belong and who had forfeited that right. A man who looked at a woman in a gray dress at the back of someone else's wedding and decided before she had said a single word that she was worth stopping for. Beautiful. Are you alone? I wasn't anymore.